you so much, Ann, for coming. Ann is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and psychotherapist. She went back for training at a young age. For more than 25 years, she worked at Maclean's Magazines, Canada's News Weekly, where she was perhaps best known as chief architect of Maclean's University Rankings for a series of, how did you victory, by the way? I don't know.
Well,
Columns on modern life, including The Boy Can't Sleep, anthologized in Carol Shields' Dropped at Threads 2. In 2013, Ann wrote Drink, the Intimate Relationship Between Women and Alcohol, a book named one of the top 10 of the year by the Washington Post. Part memoir, part journalistic exploration, the book exposes the pinking of the alcohol industry. Says Gabor Mate, did I pronounce that? The writing is gripping and vivid with a personal voice, and research exacting, the stories revealing, if sometimes heartbreaking, and the conclusions essential. A triumphant life, a triumphant book. And I'm not paid to say this, but there are copies in the back available for a very modest price. I highly recommend it. Anyway, since the publication of Drink, Ann has worked hard to destigmatize mental health and addiction, earning an honorary Doctor of Law from Queen's University for her efforts. She's also the recipient of the Transforming Lives Award from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, the American Research Society on Addiction's Media Award, plus the TA Suite Award from the Ontario Psychiatric Association for helping address stigma related to mental health and addiction. Welcome, Ann Dowsett Johnston.
thank you, Tim. It is such a pleasure to be here and to be hosted by your center. And can everyone hear me? Yeah, everyone can hear me. Wow, it's an amazing feeling to be in a room with your loved ones. I'm used to being at the front of the room, but I have to take a minute and say, I don't often get weepy. There's a woman at the back of the room who taught me everything. Nancy Poole, who I went to and said, I am about to do this thing I really want to do, which is I want a fellowship to write about women and alcohol at a time when nobody believed it was a subject. In fact, as one bow-tied famous journalist, unnamed, said, you must be talking about Indigenous women. And I said, I'm not. I'm talking about all women. And I had a coffee at a Starbucks with Nancy and said, where do I begin? And she said, I won't leave your side. I will teach you. And she did. And I wasn't expecting her. So that's a long time ago. That's a long time ago. That's 2010. And I wanted to make sense of the fact that my beloved and beautiful mother had fallen down the bunny hole of alcohol, and that indeed so had I. And I wanted to make sense of it in a way. I want to use my journalistic skills to figure it out. It was like a puzzle. I couldn't figure it out. And Nancy said a sentence much later, near the end of our conversation, that made the whole thing make sense for me, which was simply this. People ask, what's wrong with that woman? And the question should be, what happened to her? And today, the hairs on my forearms go up when I hear that, because it's everything. It was like there were a couple of people who told me things and the penny would drop. The penny would drop. And I'll get to one of, at the very end, something somebody else told me that was also very powerful here in BC, that also made the penny drop. So my job today is to talk to you about what happened in the intervening years. You know, I decided to, after 3 decades as a journalist, to turn my attention to women and alcohol. People thought I was making it up when I talked about the pinking of the alcohol market. And this is all when I was writing for the Toronto Star before I wrote my book. And I just wanted to reflect on what has worked out, where we've come in 10 years since my book was published, and where we should be headed. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure on some levels, but where we should be. But all I will say is that I was in Calgary on a lovely family vacation in the Rockies last weekend, and I went for breakfast in an airport hotel, and at 7:30 in the morning, there was a bottle of tequila on every breakfast table. And I had lunch with my beautiful friend, Deborah Robertson, yesterday, having landed at Sydney by the Sea. And the first thing we were offered was 50% off wine. So we live in an alcoholic culture that hasn't changed. It's only become more so. And I'm just fascinated. I'm eternally fascinated by what's happened. So I'll just start by saying it's just such a pleasure to be with you here today. I usually start with a corny joke or two, but I don't have the heart to do it. Nancy kind of took my breath away. You know, it's also 10 years since I flew to New Zealand. My family thought I was crazy to do my TEDx talk on women and drinking. And that TEDx talk now has 1.5 million views. And it was a terrible way to see New Zealand. There was no teleprompter. And so I spent the week in a hotel writing what I wanted to write and memorizing it because there wouldn't be any script, but it was worth it. This is a passion of mine. This is my passion, my life passion. I'm about to dig into my next book, and it's no surprise it's about women and drinking. Much more personal look at myself and my mother than the last book. But so where do I want to begin? I'm not going to begin where I have already not begun where I was going to begin. Because it's, you know, fascinating to me that there are people in this room today, and I know that we have other people who are watching on Zoom. There are people in this room who helped me put this story together and figure things out. And one of them is Sarah Roberts, who's sitting here, who drove across the island, who has taught me so much about health and how one puts one's life together once one puts down the wine glass. So we're all in a very interesting journey in a culture that normalizes risky drinking, and a culture which sees motherhood as synonymous with the need to numb or celebrate or escape with alcohol, and a culture which is alcoholic. I think that, you know, it's fascinating that I didn't crack up my car. I didn't lose my home. I did lose my job. I didn't used to talk about that. I'm not supposed to, but I did lose my job. But I didn't miss much work. And in fact, I won a lot of awards at work. But at the end, I was in trouble, deep, intractable trouble. And when I wrote Drink, Quit Lit wasn't really a thing at the time. The year was 2013, and Carolyn Knapp had written her beautiful book, Drinking a Love Story. But, you know, there was no Holly, no Laura, no, the other gang hadn't appeared yet. I want to spend a minute on my mom. They say you have three lives: a personal life, a public life, and a private life, secret private life. And the secret I grew up with was I was the daughter of a really beautiful woman, a beautiful writer who wrote every night. I'd go to bed to the music of her typewriter and the music of always Handel. She loved Handel. It's Waters music. And my father would be in Africa or Australia because he was in mining. And we'd be in this tiny mining town, and my highly cultured mother would be typing. And that was the music I went to bed with. And the breakfast I woke to was my mother telling me about the books she read. And I was the eldest child, and I was given this privileged space in her life when I was 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 11. And then she was prescribed Valium. because she had these 3 kids in this mining town, and people thought she was anxious, and she started mixing Valium with alcohol. And my mother slowly disappeared, and the typewriter slowly was silent. And my mother took to her bed and didn't really come out and stopped wearing clothes for about 3 decades. And it got worse. And, you know, that's not a totally uncommon story for her era. Betty Ford made that clear. But it was a horrendous loss of a person being erased. I spent a lot of nights wondering, writing drink was never hard, but learning was easy. Teachers like Nancy and others, Tim, David Jernigan, other people. But going to bed every night was hard. Going to bed and wondering if I had the guts to tell this story, the guts to tell a story on myself. And my sister, who is senior in vet medicine at a Canadian university, would have kept saying, you can't tell these stories, Anne, you cannot tell these stories. And I'd say, you cannot call a book Drink and not tell the stories. So like the time when I was vice principal of McGill University, and my boss came to pick me up with a limo to go to the senior executive retreat, rang the doorbell 4 times with the VP of research, and I didn't show up. They went to the country without me, drove 2 hours. And, you know, I had fired someone the night before and gone and soothed my woes with vodka. So my aim was to tell the nature of, I'm not going to call it a disease. I'm going to call it an affliction, because I don't believe it's a disease, but we're not going to get into that today. But I told the worst on myself. I told the worst on myself because I grew up with that secret, and that secret didn't help anybody. It didn't help me, and didn't help my family. And I shared the story of my depression, which had been totally, Tim and I were talking about Mark Lewis, Biology of Desire. It was a total natural thing for me to do, the daughter of someone cross-addicted to Valium, to not take an antidepressant. It seemed like the wrong thing for me to take a pill. And so I drank. One day, I received the biggest wake-up call I would receive, which was my mother, day card from my son, who was then about 17, was handed to me at breakfast. And I thought, this is gorgeous. He was a glorious artist. And it said, Portrait of a Happy Mother. And I thought, this is the most beautiful watercolor I've ever seen. And then I read the fine print, and it said, white eyes, not bloodshot. It said, drinking Perrier, not wine. And it said, writing, not editing. In other words, he knew me. So my son was the truth teller. Long before I became an alcoholic, I was a workaholic like my father. I figured if I followed his footsteps and worked hard the way he had, and maybe some of you can relate to this, that I would avoid the trap my mother had set. But that led to burnout. And of course, that led to drinking as well. So we're sold a bill of goods, and I was deeply ensconced in a corporate world that wasn't very kind to women. And going home and drinking was an easy alternative. When I tried to quit because I woke up on Father's Day in 2007. I was VP of McGill. I lived in a beautiful condo. And I took a call that said that my favorite cousin, Doug, had been killed by a drunk driver. He had his youngest of 4 children in the front seat of his car. And she was brain damaged, and he was dead. And I remember sitting on the floor of the condo and thinking, I lost my childhood to alcohol. I've lost Doug to alcohol, and I'm now losing myself to alcohol. And so I made a valiant attempt, produced a big poster board called The Wall of Why Should I Live? And put pictures of my son, picture of my dog, favorite poetry, Yeats, George O'Keeffe, etc. Why should I live? And decided to quit drinking. And it dug in. It dug in so hard. It would be another year and a half before I quit drinking, and things got a lot worse. It got far worse. And the worst was my getting blackout drunk at his wake, which didn't make me popular. I still to this day have not had a family member tell me how I got home that night. But that was the last time I drank to inebriation, and I ended up in rehab. It was a long dance for me, a long dance for me to quit drinking, post-rehab, etc. So what I want to talk about today is, there's lots of you nodding and lots of you have read my book and lots of you know these stories, but some of you don't. But what you all know is that female drinking has become an epidemic. And David Jernigan said so eloquently to me last year, you know, it is the epidemic that got hidden in the pandemic. It was buried as the numbers for women increased, as I predicted in my book, as others have predicted, many in this room. It was buried news. And imagine, you know, if I call it the 4 shifts of women and what happened. So not the 2 shifts, but the 4 shifts. You get up in the morning, you get children to school, you go to work yourself, 2nd shift, you come home, you are chopping vegetables at the vegetable board and you're pouring a glass of wine. 3rd shift, you're feeding, cleaning dishes. 4th shift, you are doing emails, finishing up work, at least 4 shifts. I call, as you know, I call alcohol the modern woman's steroid, enabling her to do the heavy lifting in a culture that is not caught up to the realities of female living, female life. And so no coincidence, all of us know this, that during the pandemic, children homeschooled, etc., things were just ratcheted up. We also live in a culture, as I said, that sees drinking as a joke and very sophisticated. Know your wines, you're cultured, know your vodkas, you're hip, know your coolers, you are young and female. And that hasn't changed. That's only more so. It's only more so than it's ever been. And in this country, which is so startling, is that we see a full 79% of Canadians 15 and over drinking. And we do not see alcohol as a drug. We just don't. It's, in fact, the only drug, I think, that you have to excuse yourself for not consuming. And wine, which was my drug of choice, is seen as a food group. You know, you pair it with X and something good for you, like an omega-3. And we haven't caught up. We haven't changed our minds about this. It's been a fascinating year since the low risk drinking guidelines were reissued. I see a lot in my client group of people talking about the health of drinking and questioning it more than they ever have before. But I don't see a lot of social support for, I mean, maybe more for dry January this year than in recent years, but how about dry February? And I'm no prohibitionist. God knows that I spent a lot of time enjoying wine. And I think we forget one of the things when we do not say it was fun. For me, drinking was fun before it really wasn't. Before it all turned, it was fun. But this trend is, I was talking to a client 2 days ago who said to me, she's a very advanced and a stunning tennis player. And she said, we played till 9 o'clock, 10 women the other night. And the other 9 got into their cars and drove home having had 4 glasses of wine each. And it's normalized. It's totally normalized. So we do live in a culture where we other, the guy on the park bench. But that's so outmoded. It's so outmoded. And I have people say to me, I never see alcohol advertising. And I say, you don't see it because it's the wallpaper. It's in every movie. It's in every television show. And I'm stunned that my book is 10 years old and people are still waking up to the breast cancer connection. They're still waking up to the carcinogen issue. They're still waking up to, and maybe they are waking up to the issue with the low-risk drinking guidelines. But I was saying to Tim, I did hundreds of interviews when those drinking guidelines came out, and people would say cheerfully on CBC syndication, and how do you think they'll be received? And I said, the population's going to hate these low-risk drinking guidelines. They're going to hate them. They're going to hate them, and they're going to say Canada is a place where fun has gone to die. It's going to take a long time for people to catch up. So I've given you a lot of bad news and a lot of material that you know and know all too well. What is interesting? What is interesting is that the alcohol-free beverage industry is going through the roof. That's interesting. What is interesting is the client after client of mine who is quietly making choices on their own and knowing the wisdom of arriving at a party with their bag already prepared with what it is they're going to drink, whether it's ginger beer or it's, partake or whatever it is, who understands that the best thing to do is to put a glass in their hand and change the subject and say, how are you? How are your kids? How's your job going? I mean, people are getting a little more adept and a little deft about this. But where we aren't is understanding that telescoping is real, that women are much more vulnerable health-wise when it comes to alcohol. We have a very interesting landscape in terms of modern recovery, and there's several members of the Luckiest Club here and lots of members of She Recovers, and we have Dawn Nickel here with us, which is fantastic. And such a powerful group and such a powerful groups for women and female support. And that is a very different picture than when I first got sober and was walking down the steps of dark church basement, drinking bad coffee in 12-step. And 12-step is still the heart and soul of many people's lives. And I'm not dissing it, but I am saying, isn't it wonderful that there's a choice? Isn't it wonderful that there is what I call serenity sisterhoods that really make a difference? What I am disturbed by is that we're not having a public conversation. We're not having a public conversation about the health risks. We're not having a public conversation about how we live, how we socialize, the values of this culture. And I'm not sure who's going to jumpstart that conversation. I'm not sure who and how that's going to turn around, because I believe that alcohol still is the modern woman's steroid. I really believe that. I really believe that from the conversations that I have with women in especially the legal profession and many other corporate professions, that things haven't changed in terms of appreciation of family. I am heartened when I see guys, and I saw this recently and I was talking to a friend about it, 3 guys on a corner on a Saturday morning, one with a stroller and one with a child on his shoulders and another with 2 little kids. And I thought, yeah, the world is, I look at my son and he's got his 2-year-old and he's pitching in at a level that my father was never present. So I'm not saying it's all grim. I'm not saying, but I am saying that we still do glamorize alcohol. And it is still tough on those children. And during the pandemic, I couldn't help but be the daughter of my mother and say, how about those kids who are in that house and not going to school with the mother that is drinking or hungover? To say nothing of the father, but I'm here to talk about women and alcohol. You know, the wonderful Kay Redfield Jameson, who's a woman I just idealize, from Johns Hopkins and a literature specialist in bipolar, has bipolar herself, and also a literature professor, such a brilliant woman, once told me that when I was asking her about this issue, that most women with alcohol problems have problems with mood disorders. That's something I could talk to over a long dinner with Nancy. You know, is that true? Is that not true? That's a provocative statement, isn't it? But how we look at women's lives, how we unpack women's lives, how we unpack what their responsibilities are, what is a mood disorder and what is a burden. These are for another time. All I know is that addiction is the far end of the spectrum, and we are not in a culture that is tender or appreciative. I have a one and only son who works on Skid Row in Los Angeles with the most perplexing of the perplexed, the people at the most challenged people I've ever seen. And he's taught me that we're not a compassionate culture. I knew that already, but I know that in my bones. I know that as we hang out down there. And I don't think we're compassionate on this issue. I don't think we're compassionate on the issue of understanding, any more so than when my mother was that woman drinking the way she was and gave up her typewriter, understanding the role of alcohol and understanding what it's serving. It's going to sound tangential, but it's not tangential. I walk down streets of Toronto where I live and nobody looks at each other. Everyone's looking at their phone. It's as if Aldous Huxley has got us captive. And I come here and I see the mountains, and I come here and I see the nature, and I get a different feeling in my bones. And it's not on the streets of Vancouver that people don't look at their phones the same way. I know they do. But as I travel the country and I breathe this different air, which always brings my shoulders down for my earlobes a little bit, I have a sense of hope, even with the 50% off wine. I have a little bit of sense of hope that there is something a little more humane, a little more personable, a little more thoughtful. And I have this excitement, a twinkle even, about what Tim and his group are doing. I have a twinkle that it feels outside the sphere of Ottawa. It feels outside the sphere of, I was going to read something from my book, but I don't have a copy of it beside me. And it feels possible. It feels that maybe this group just might get it right. When I met Tim, thank you. When I met Tim, I asked him to put something together, connect some dots for me, and about women and drinking. And I'm not going to be able to find the page fast enough. So we're going to have to just put that aside. But basically, he said the implications for women were larger than for men. And they were larger for men because not only did they get into trouble, but that indeed they were more victimized, more vulnerable to men. And so often when I speak, people say, why aren't you speaking of men? And it's not that I don't look at the other 50% of the population, but there are many questions we need to ask ourselves, which is, why don't we acknowledge it as a drug? How is alcohol playing out in our community in terms of suicides, in terms of kids being abused, in terms of violence, in terms of teenage girls being in emergency rooms? I hear so much of that right now. Teenage girls being in emergency rooms that it's, you know, de rigueur that the ambulance will come out at the end of the party, at the end of the night. I'm hearing more and more of young women and end-stage liver disease in their 20s. And I guess the main and only point I wanted to say is I don't think we're having an adult conversation yet. We aren't having an adult conversation. I am extremely excited that client by client, people are coming to me and saying, I'm changing my drinking habits. But the final story I'll leave you with is there was a wonderful man. Do you remember his last name? Nancy, Dan out here. Yes. And I said, I'm trying to put this together. And he was the other wise person I talked to a lot. And I said, Dan, I'm trying to get it. And he said, you know, there's a story they tell about a frog pond where all the frogs are developing strange growths or becoming infertile. And the pond leaders get together and they decide to bring in the plastic surgeon and the fertility experts. And one wise woman says, you're barking up the wrong tree. It's something in the water. And I'm here to say that there's something in the water. And that's Dan Reese's story. So I begin with my BC connection, Nancy, and I close with my BC connection, Dan, to say there is something in the water. And 10 years on, we have the luckiest club and we have alcohol-free drinks, but we haven't got the conversation yet that we need to be having. And bravo to stay on the BC connection. Bravo to Dawn. Bravo to Dawn and her great sisterhood for keeping that connection pan-American and beyond. I was in Chicago, lucky enough to be in Chicago with hundreds of women, and we had such a remarkable time in the fall. Bravo to Joanne Frederick for gathering 13 of us in Mexico recently at the Feminary, and continuing the conversation, many of whom were She Recovers women. Bravo to Sarah for her leadership in terms of women's health and framing it from a health perspective. Bravo to Nancy for leading the fight that you've been leading for so long. Bravo to all of you, and bravo to the guy in the room. Not the only guy, but the man, for being here, for coming from Boston and being in the seat to making sure that the really hard work gets done. When I showed up in his office today, he plunked down a piece of paper with these figures, looking at the increase in deaths from excessive alcohol use. The source is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, dated today, talking about deaths from excessive alcohol use among males increasing 26.8%. Numbers are still higher per year, and for females up 34.7%. And the years we're talking about, Tim, are between 2020 and 2020. Yeah. It's shocking. Yeah, shocking. So we have to talk. We have to continue talking. All of this you already know. All of this you already know, but the solidarity of this community is critical. And your presence, there are women in this room who've come from the Sunshine Coast today, who come from Washington today, just to be here, to be part of the conversation, and ones that I may not have even met. And I really appreciate your being here. I really appreciate the 250 plus people on Zoom. And I really appreciate you wanting to be part of this conversation and part of this movement, because it is a movement, and it's a movement so precious. I'll close by saying that I do this work on behalf of my mom, because she didn't have a community who she felt she could. She came home from her third time to rehab and said, I can't tell stories about my family. They want me to talk about my family. And she plunked down her purse and went to bed. And that was it. But I lost my dear and beloved father to Korsakoff's. And so I lost both parents to drinking. And I'll just say it's no way to go. So bravo to all of you who've stared this down. And bravo to all of you for being part of the fight. Thank you so much, Tim, for making room in your schedule for me. So we have time for some questions or thoughts, if anybody has questions or thoughts.